Welcome everyone to the So You Want to Start a COVID-19 podcast webinar. It's free from PRX and PMJA. My name is Stephanie Kuo. I am the project manager for Project Catapult, which is a 20-week training program for public media stations that are looking to start podcasts at their stations. First of all, I want to thank the Public Media Journalists Association and Terry Gilday, who is also here, for co-hosting this with us. We at PRX, and for helping us spread the word. At PRX, we are big believers in keeping public media and podcasting open and accessible for all, and sharing everything we know and we learn in podcasting and in this industry is fundamental to that. So this is why we started a webinar, because we noticed that there was a lot of talk about podcasting around this big global event. First off, though, I have some webinar instructions. If this is your first time ever using Zoom webinar, it has some interesting functions and it's really fun to share. So first off, there is a Q&A toolbar. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's an option to submit written questions that we can kind of answer as we go along in text. Carrie Donahue will be managing that. But there will also be a Q&A section at the end of this webinar where you can ask live questions. All you have to do is raise your hand. There's also a button in that toolbar, and Carrie will be on deck to unmute you, and you can ask your question live, or you can type your question out and any one of our panelists can answer. None of us can actually see any of you, our audience members, so we'll do our best to look and sound our best, despite not having a lot of visual cues. But if you would like to speak, just raise your hand or type in a Q&A. Otherwise, I'm going to get this started. All right, so my name is Stephanie Kuo, and I'm the project manager for Project Catapult. Carrie?
And I'm Carrie Donahue. I'm the director of training at PRX, so manage everything from projects like Project Catapult to the podcast garages that we open. We're so glad to see everyone, and we want to give a shout out as well to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which has been the funder of Project Catapult. And when we set about doing this webinar, we were so delighted to hear stations from across the different years and cohorts of Project Catapult say so many similar things about what motivated them and how they started thinking about how to make this podcast. So we wanted to bring all that information to all of you. Thank you so much for showing up.
And Terry?
Hi, everyone. I'm Terry Gilliam, the Executive Director of Public Media Journalists Association, PMJA. Thrilled to be here today supporting Carrie and Stephanie and Project Catapult. It has been amazing to see Project Catapult be the tremendous resource that it is for stations cultivating podcasts. I feel like the level of podcasts, the quality of podcasts has just skyrocketed with this incredible incubation program that PRX has put together. And if you were at the PMJA conference last summer in DC, you got a treat to see, I think about 5 podcasts, Carrie and Stephanie, that you guys are putting together, including one from one of my former stations, KUER, Preach, with Lee Hale, which has been a tremendous resource for that station and that community. So really thrilled to be here today. This is going to be a fantastic webinar, and Catapult is going to provide some great information for stations wanting to use podcasts as a way to reach their audiences in this really critical time. But really, really happy to support PRX in this endeavor.
Thank you, Terry. So we mentioned Project Catapult a lot, and if you haven't had a lot of experience, or if you haven't really heard about Project Catapult, like I said, it's a 20-week training accelerator and training program and accelerator podcast program for public media stations. We employ things like design thinking and a lot of the mindsets and principles around like designing for a core audience member. And that's what we believe is what makes all of our podcasts such great success. So I'm going to set the stage here. So why are we here? PRX began noticing that producers from our Catapult program were developing shows. And at first we said, let's just sit down with them and figure out what's happening. What are they doing? And it was clear when we sat down with them and we discussed how they were developing it and what decisions were going behind some of this, that Carrie and I were slacking each other offline, giving each other literal heart eyes, because it was very clear to us that the process we teach, which prioritizes empathy, audience-first design, a bias toward action, prototyping, and iterating, was playing a huge role in how these shows were developing and how all of that was becoming universal language and mindsets across all 3 cohorts of our Project Catapult program dating back to, I believe, 2016, 2017, Carrie. So that made us feel great. And so we thought, why not try to take what they're learning throughout this process and impart some of that knowledge and their learnings on others who are trying to find their place in this very specific growing vertical of coronavirus podcast right now. So many of you out there might be trying to decide if developing a Corona podcast is worth it right now. Maybe some of you have some already in development and you're just looking for a different perspective on how to go about this. We know that resources are limited. Everyone is already kind of inundated with COVID-19 information across all platforms. And Carrie and I have joked that, like, you know, NPR's kind of already got a coronavirus podcast. So what do I have? Like, what business do I have making one? And actually, we believe that even with all of this happening, this is a great opportunity to deepen engagement with your specific communities and your specific audiences around this very enormous global event. And perhaps some outlets that are more national or international in nature aren't serving your more local audiences in a way that's most meaningful to them. So whether you're looking to expand on your current news coverage or provide a whole new outlet for your listeners around this event and around this issue, this webinar will offer lessons learned from 5 Catapult stations that have developed coronavirus podcasts, and they did it quickly because this is an unfolding event that's happening very rapidly, and they did so thoughtfully as well. So these stations couple design thinking with some go-getter spirit to make their shows possible. They have a lot to share about what to do, what worked, what didn't, how they're maintaining momentum, staying ambitious, and how they're also being realistic about the challenges and the successes in this process. So we're so happy to have them here. And with that, I will pass it over for their individual introductions. Actually, I did make a really great video, which didn't get used. Look. All right, so Aaron, start us off.
All right. Hey guys, nice to be with you all virtually. My name is Aaron Henkin. I work at WYPR, the public radio affiliate here in Baltimore. And I guess with you want me to go ahead and start talking about the podcast, or just say?
Oh no, just your individual introductions for now.
Oh, okay. Aaron Henkin, WYPR. How about that? Good.
Great.
Kinsey Moreland, and I am the podcast producer / project coordinator for KPBS in San Diego, Tijuana.
Brad Turner. I'm the executive producer for our audio innovation studio at Colorado Public Radio, and I worked with Project Catapult to launch our podcast called On Something about marijuana legalization.
I'm Tim Lloyd. I'm the senior producer of on-demand and content partnerships at St. Louis Public Radio, and a show that I managed called We Live Here was part of the very first Catapult cohort, and it was a great experience, and I'm happy to be with everyone today.
Hey everybody, I'm Sam Whitehead. I'm the health reporter at WABE. We're the NPR station down here in Atlanta, one of 2. One of the producers on our show, Did You Wash Your Hands, actually went through Project Catapult and launched a podcast a few years ago. So he is helping us put our, for now, daily coronavirus podcast together, which I am kind of host and senior producer of.
Great. So now we'll go into each individual podcast. So these are the 5 podcasts that are coronavirus podcasts that each of our stations have produced. I have prepared a audio sample for each of them. And so I thought that we'd go through and play a quick clip for each show in this order. And then that respective producer can kind of give a background on what the podcast is about and why they started it. So first up, we have Aaron Henkin with the Daily Dose. Let me know, panelists, if this sounds good.
Maryland officials announced today that they are expecting a $2.8 billion drop in revenues for the 3 months that end June 30th. Governor Larry Hogan responded with a state budget and hiring freeze.
Hogan said the budget freeze won't apply.
From a conversation about drug dealers and users, let's shift our attention now to how the coronavirus pandemic is impacting the recovery community.
Just take it a day at a time.
The state's emergency management agency has launched a site called the Maryland Coronavirus Rumor Control Page.
We have a team that is maintaining this page.
Got a couple of calls today from Baltimore City Public Schools educators.
My thing is just basically letting them know that we're all in there together. So everyone stay safe and be well.
We're always happy to hear from you, and we will be here for you again tomorrow.
Do I talk now, or are you going to play more clips? Yeah. I got tapped to produce this podcast, The Daily Dose. It started with an email from our general manager, LaFontaine Oliver. I believe the subject heading line was "Crazy Idea," and he wrote, "I've been thinking about ways to provide a really high level of public service to our community amidst the coronavirus onset." This is when it was still an onset. That would also not stretch our resources too thin. Would you be open to helping with a limited run daily podcast on coronavirus in Maryland? This may sound scary and daunting, but what I'm envisioning is aggregating the day's local news content into a short, maybe 10-minute podcast. Much of the good work that the news team is doing is heard only once on air, and that's it. This would give it life and further exposure, and hopefully help our community stay informed and chronicle our journey through the pandemic. Let me know your thoughts. So, short answer. My boss asked me to do this. I thought it was a smart idea, so I said, okay, and I was basically reassigned that day.
Great. Up next, we have San Diego Matters with a clip from what they're calling a pandemic pivot, like a pop-up podcast.
I'm just going to start Instagram living from my couch and let people from the community into my Instagram Live to talk to my followers directly.
Some of the things we have right now that are really good for your pantry would be our canned tuna. We've got regular solid pack tuna and olive oil, as well as
what are you selling? Where are you open? Where's your hours? What precautions are you taking? And they were able to tell their story directly instead of me being the intermediary in it, and kind of a slow intermediary, to be quite honest with you. My whole job shifted. I need to do information triage now instead of information,
processing. Yeah.
Exactly. Thinking about things long term was a luxury.
I'm Kinsey Moreland, and this is a pop-up podcast series we're calling the Pandemic Pivot. We're checking in with our community to see how we're coming up with creative ways to navigate our new lives with COVID-19, talking to people who've done this pivot. Look, we're all feeling really scared right now, confused, isolated, and alone. The KPBS Newsroom is working overtime right now to bring you the latest local breaking news related to the coronavirus. You can find that live coverage online at kpbs.org/coronavirus or weekdays right here in the San Diego News Matters podcast feed. In this Sunday pop-up series, we won't be bringing you that kind of breaking news. Instead, our goal is to make you, me, and everyone who listens feel just a little bit less alone, or at least alone together.
All right. Hi. So I am a Catapult participant, and we're in the most recent cohort. So we just sort of wrapped up the training portion. And right when it all hit, I produce normally a border podcast. And it's a sound-rich journey type podcast that takes our listeners often through the border. And so the border closed to almost all traffic, and we were stuck, but we only stayed stuck for a couple days until we realized, from just looking at audience data, from looking at what our website was doing, average story gets a couple thousand hits. Suddenly our live coronavirus blog was getting, upwards of 50,000 hits a day and more sometimes. And we knew that because people didn't have their daily commutes, they didn't get their morning edition, all things considered, morning and afternoon drive time, that there was a need. And we watched our daily news podcast, San Diego News Matters, which at that point was just a repackaged broadcast to podcast type show, which is what I think a lot of maybe larger public media stations try to do. They just take what they do on air and put it together and push it into the podcast space. which is fine, but it's kind of the bare minimum of what a public media station can do in the podcast space with their news. And we saw the downloads quickly doubling, and seeing that, we knew that there was an increased appetite and need for daily COVID news in podcast form. So we quickly pivoted ourselves and took me off the Border podcast. And now I work Monday through Thursday, and then on Sunday nights to produce the daily podcast, San Diego News Matters, which is all COVID news at this point. And then the special Sunday show, which you heard a clip from, where I think one of the most valuable things I learned through the Catapult process was to think about how people are feeling. And I know that sounds mushy, but you know, we were all just feeling super disconnected, and it was inspiring to see so many people from our community stepping up to move their poetry readings online, to move their parenting support groups online, to, you know, even though he's the food journalist who lost his job, he is sort of famous on the Food Network, and he has like 60,000 plus followers on social media. So even though he himself lost his job as a food critic, he pivoted and now brings people food news through Instagram Live. And, you know, restaurants have been hit particularly hard through the pandemic. So just telling these stories and thinking about, not only in our daily news podcast, how can we take the latest breaking news? Because you guys know in public media, the pace, sometimes the news of the morning is yesterday's news. That's just how broadcast journalism can often work, because it's slower paced. And by working late at night, we're getting, you know, last night, Trump tweeted about closing immigration, you know, and so we actually had the podcast done by the time Trump sent his tweet about completely shutting down immigration, and we opened it back up and we added that in. So we just really wanted people to get the latest news. And then at the end of every podcast, even in our daily show, again, I think about how listeners are feeling after I just delivered, because I'm the host, so I'm reading it, and I know how it makes me feel by reading that news, and it's just hardcore, sad, depressing, intense. And so at the end, we always try to leave people with a little, like, here's a little example of how, you know, something innovative or creative or cool that people are doing, kind of inspired or forced by the pandemic.
Thank you, Kinsey. Next up, we have Colorado Public Radio's At a Distance. We'll play a clip from one of their episodes.
And here's another one of Allison's important tips. Move around your house. Fold laundry in one room, make your meals in another room, and do your work in another.
When you've been stuck inside for 430 days, sitting at the same place to do tasks on your computer all the time just gets old. So like when you live your whole life at home, your home is your coffee shop, it's your library, it's your office, it's your school, it's your social space, it's your gym, and your space to relax and sleep, which your home always was, right?
Right.
And so to me, like, I have to create that feeling within my own house, which is why I move through different spaces in my house, so it kind of mimics that sensation.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. May, I haven't been doing that at all. Have you been doing that? I've been just at my kitchen table.
No, I haven't been doing much of anything that they've that people recommend I do. I have been doing everything in my living room, which has made it kind of hard, because at the end of the day, like when I'm done working, I just stay there where I was working to watch TV and just relax, which is difficult. And I know it's not the best thing to do, but I just, you know, like we are not used to this style of living, I guess.
Yes, it's a huge adjustment.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was a clip from the first episode of At a Distance. We designed the podcast as kind of a complement to the other daily reporting we are doing around coronavirus in Colorado. It's intended to be a little more like a life kit, or even Kind World, if you're familiar with those programs. We have a pair of co-hosts who talk to people who are experiencing the pandemic in some unusual way. And they try to come away with some sort of practical tips for what this means, how you can make your life better while social distancing, and hopefully the listener kind of feels seen through all of this. In that episode, in that clip you just heard, that was from our first episode. We actually got an email from a listener who has been living in her house almost never leaving for something like 15 or 16 months due to a chronic condition. And she said, I've learned some things that I think can help people who are struggling with social distancing. And so we interviewed her. She had an interesting backstory. She had some good advice, and she sounded, it was just a good empathetic way to kick off the series. So when Kinsey talks about thinking about how listeners are feeling, that's something we think about a lot. And we've actually interviewed, listeners and gotten feedback from them about what resonates and what doesn't resonate for them. The podcast also fits into our news reporting here at CPR because we can put it on our daily talk show once a week and have something that kind of changes the pace and sound of what you're hearing from our other reporting. And I can talk more about all that later. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. There's a huge cement truck in front of my apartment, so sorry if you hear that. Next up, we have Tim Lloyd with We Live Here. They actually have a really interesting story, but I'll play you a clip from one of their most recent episodes, and then I'll let Tim take it from here.
My sister came to visit me in St. Louis when cases of COVID-19 began to emerge in the U.S., first from people returning from international travel, then from community transmission. We started to read reports of anti-Asian xenophobia across the country, sometimes expressed through verbal threats and sometimes bursting out with physical violence. The virus hadn't emerged in St. Louis yet, but I caught a winter cold. I didn't want to spread the cold to others, so I found the fabric mask I bought the last time I visited Taiwan. It had come in handy the previous winter when I had bronchitis. But with reports of COVID-19 and anti-Asian xenophobia, I wasn't so sure. Would people look at me weird? Would they shout something unkind to me, or worse? The worry that people would look at me weird wasn't new, but the fear of being blamed for a pandemic was. Weeks passed, and I went with my partner to vote in Missouri's presidential primary election. When we left the polling place, he said, "I don't know if I should say this to you, and I'm not sure, but I think someone was glaring at you because you're Asian."
Hi, so that is our current host, Jialin Yang, delivering a bit of a personal essay at the top of an episode about the concern about the rise of xenophobia in St. Louis and really across the country. We Live Here is not a new show. It's been around for roughly 5 years at this point. And the mission of the show is pretty straightforward. We use deep and personal audio storytelling to expose inequity in St. Louis and beyond. And about 6 weeks ago, we had a season ready to go. We were a week out from launching a number of episodes on the Black experience on college campuses in St. Louis and elsewhere in the country. And a couple of things that really directly relate to Catapult and design thinking. When it became apparent that the world is about to change in a very significant way, I sort of checked in with myself and thinking about our POVs and our general audience and how they would feel about a series of episodes about a world that will feel probably pretty distant in some respects in just a few weeks. And so I made a decision that we're just going to push pause on that. We're going to hang on to that content, and hopefully this fog will clear and we'll get back to what we had hoped to release to our audience at some point. But for now, the world has changed, and I sent an email. I talked to the show's producers, and they were in agreement, and I sent an email to senior leadership at our station saying, listen, we're going to pivot, a word that anybody who's gone through any of the Catapult trainings will recognize, and certainly a skill that I refined as part of being part of the Catapult 1, and decided, we're going to quickly move to looking at how inequities are going to be brought to light by not only this outbreak, but ultimately the recovery. Because St. Louis, like I'm sure many of the communities that you serve with your stations, is really, in many respects, characterized by the racial and economic divisions and inequities. And I gave my producers 3 very straightforward directions. First was take care of yourself, make sure you pace yourself, and this is going to be a stressful time. Number 2, make sure you focus on humanity. And I think that that's what, in that clip, I think that that's a good example of that. Make sure you focus on your own humanity and the humanity of others. That's something that podcasting in this medium can do especially well. And then third, think about the what's next. In the past, we were released every other week. We've moved to a weekly release schedule. I don't think we're going to be in a position to be a daily show. So and we're going to touch topics that are in the daily news, but we need to be looking ahead. So the what's next, is there a solution? Is there another growing problem on the horizon? Make sure that that's part of our just sort of general coverage. So again, just make sure that they take care of themselves, make sure that they focus on humanity, and make sure they think about what's coming next.
Great, thank you, Tim. And I don't know if you said this, but essentially this is an existing show that you took a pandemic. You're looking at the pandemic through the lens of equity, which is the mission of your show.
Very much so, yes. That is hardwired into what we do.
Great, thank you so much. Finally, we have Sam Whitehead from WABE with Did You Wash Your Hands?
As many parts of life have slowed down, our country's supply chain hasn't, and commercial truck drivers are a crucial part of that chain. Jess Graham is an over-the-road owner-operator truck driver working for GTO Trucking in Snellville, Georgia.
I'm out here. If I'm going to be quarantined, I might as well be quarantined in my truck and continue to work. Last week, I did almost 4,000 miles, so it's almost double to what I've been doing up to this point. And out of the 5 loads, 4 of them were medical supplies or food. I do what I can to, I wear a mask when I leave the truck and I'm interacting with people. I limit my exposure outside of the truck. I don't just get out and wander around anymore. You can go to a gas station anywhere. I can only go to certain places. And at those certain places, that's the equivalent to everything you have at home. That's where I have to wash my laundry. That's where I have to take my shower. You might go to a truck stop and expect to get something to eat only to find out it's closed or it's limited or the restaurant is only open till 8 o'clock now. Some places they're not willing to take on the task of really cleaning the shower, so then they just close and said the showers are down. I think as a driver, it's in our nature to just haul that freight, just get it going. It doesn't matter what chaos is going on. We thrive in that next mile.
Cool. So yeah, that was from an episode we did not too long ago, just looking at kind of work in the time of a pandemic, how it has changed for so many people in so many different ways. And I'm glad we played that one because I think it gets to kind of what this show really is, which is a show mainly just about conversations with different kinds of people. I'm our health reporter, and so as of February, everything I was doing was already coronavirus focused. And so the adults at my station kind of said, hey, Sam is having these conversations with people every day, not only kind of regular folks like we heard in that piece, but state officials, federal officials, that kind of thing. Why don't we use a podcast as the platform for those conversations to kind of strip out all the work that might go into producing a feature and really a radio feature rather, and kind of putting those conversations in a podcast form. And so we did stand this up from scratch. Certainly people in our organization had experience that they got from PRX. So part of this was just kind of, building the plane as we were trying to get it in the air. So that's not to say there haven't been some bumps, but we featured voices like that to, probably our biggest get was with the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is here in Atlanta. So that's a little bit about what we are trying with our show.
Great, and we'll all get to expand on each of the thinking behind each of your shows with all these subsequent questions, one of which we've already answered this one. But the next question I think a lot of people are wondering is like, how did you do it, right? Sam, like you said, you were trying to get the plane in the air as you were building it. I know a lot of people are wondering, how did you develop a workflow when each of you had stations that were already kind of doing things? How did you create a workflow or process for existing staff? How did you even get it started? I know that I heard in our preliminary calls that some of you were prototyping and piloting some episodes. And I guess my last question is, how did you know that you all had it and you were comfortable kind of going live with it? So I'm going to open up the floor to anybody who would like to answer. And I hope you all are rushing to do so.
I mean, I'm happy to jump back in since I was maybe the last to mention that. I mean, I can say for me, I'm our health reporter, but I also do a fair bit of hosting here at our station. And I would say that kind of let's produce a daily conversation workflow was something that I was already very comfortable with, and the people that I work with were very comfortable with. It is the kind of thing that once you kind of get that muscle memory down, because if you're producing, say, for ATC, you've got to cut it down to 4 minutes. It feels like a luxury to have 10. You can really get that easily into this space, and then think about kind of other production things you can do to make it a more interesting and engaging listen. So I would say that was the thing for us is, people in our newsroom are really building off experience we have kind of filling our local segments in the news magazines, and how can we put that into the podcast space?
I'll hop in for a quick second. So this is really where the design thinking and prototyping that PRX's Project Catapult is all about really kind of came into play for us here at WYPR. This project is me and our news editor, a woman named Danielle Irby. And, we got this assignment and we created our first prototype the day after we got assigned the project, I think. And then another one the very next day. And then again and again, I think for a week before we felt like we had an episode that sounded the way we wanted it to sound. And by prototyping, you get your workflow down. You have these iterative products to share with the staff, and you get this very valuable, very specific feedback on everything from the pacing, the music breaks, the tone of the host, the balance of the spots, the features, the two ways, the listener voicemails. It's much easier, we learned in Project Catapult to get quality feedback on a prototype than it is to get feedback on a vague idea. So, and you also, as you heard Sam say, really get a sense of, well, how much time is this going to take? What's the most time consuming step in the process? And you really get an idea of what you're in for time-wise and resource-wise in the prototyping process as well.
I'll jump in. For At a Distance, we moved pretty fast on this. A big step for me was listening to lots of other pandemic podcasts. I think I listened to 10 or 12, and I thought about what elements were going well with CNN's podcast or the Atlantic's podcast. There's one called Staying In from 3 Uncanny 4 that I really love. And so it was good to know what was out there and think about how we might fit into the marketplace, although I think that's a secondary consideration right now because we're just trying to super serve our listeners. That's part of the goal. But what we did was we made 3 pilots, and one of it was sort of a daily bulletin of what's going on, and maybe the one coronavirus interview from CPR that we felt our listeners needed to be able to access on demand. But we ultimately went a different direction because we already have a daily interview show that gets podcast, and that was usually where we would be pulling from. So over the course of I think we made 3 pilots before we settled on the one that became episode 1. We kind of fine-tuned the overall sound. We thought about, sound design was a part of this because our hosts are sitting in their bedroom or their kitchen making this, and it's less than optimal sound quality. And so we've kind of embraced that lo-fi sound to an extent, even with the music we're using. We grabbed a theme song that would sound sort of comforting and cozy, we hope. based on what the hosts liked to listen to. Worked with a graphic designer on staff to throw the artwork together quickly, and then got it out there as fast as we could. After we launched, and I don't recommend doing it this way if you have time. Then we did some of the POV work and the sort of idea of getting listener feedback. We did a little survey and found some people who are kind of ideal core listeners for the podcast and talked to them about what they were getting out of it. And we've kind of fine-tuned our approach and our and who we think we're making it for, the overall sensibility of the show as a result since then. And I can talk about that a little more later on when we talk about marketing.
And Kinsey from KPBS, we prototyped one version of the daily show and then one version of the Sunday pop-up series, and probably not following best practices, didn't even wait for a ton of feedback before we just went live. And I guess there was just a real sense of urgency. So I feel like we're still iterating a lot and in front of an audience and still collecting feedback. We, set up a Google Voice number and we ask people to call us and text us. And we just try to keep talking to people as we go about things that they like, things they don't like, ideas they have about the show. But someone asked, what suggestions would you have for a one-person show? And David, for the daily, I just started out myself working on it and did the prototype myself. And then I don't know if you're an indie producer or if you have access to a potential team, because once they heard what it could be, I got buy-in from a news editor and from a sound designer. So kind of built the team as I went. But it is possible to do a one-person show, I think. And then, I feel like just continuing to check in to the audience, with the audience, just talking to them, talking to humans, and then also checking in with people who are not listening, but maybe should be listening, and why they're not, and what their lives are like now, and how can we better shape our show to fit their lives. One question someone asked is to hear something about changes in podcast listening with new COVID people at home situation. I think, I've been seeing data come in that podcast listening in general is down. I don't know if people are seeing that data as well. But for us, for our specific news shows and local news about COVID, there's only so much of that out there. There's tons of national, right? There's tons of national. You can't compete with national COVID news. You can't cover Trump. But with local, there is a real demand. There's a real need. And we, again, are seeing our numbers quickly double. And now we're looking at tripling our numbers.
For us, it was a little bit less challenging in terms of general workflow, because it was moving an existing show into this, into looking at COVID specifically. So that wasn't as challenging. Probably the most difficult part was figuring out, I think, Brad, you had mentioned this, figuring out sort of how to handle the sound design, the nuts and bolts of the show, as a host is remote recording in like a makeshift booth made out of couch cushions on a field kit. It's like, that's not something I was really prepared to have to figure out. But I think we had a good sense of what the show is and what it can be. So there was a little bit less on the prototyping side, but we listen a lot to what listeners have to say about the work that's being done. And thus far, I think, it's been really refreshing to see the tweets and stuff on Facebook about how people are finding the work that the show is doing really meaningful. And, the biggest challenge was just figuring out the literal workflow of doing this remotely and being a little bit more regimented about some things that I think can be easily taken for granted, like naming conventions for clips and stuff like that, and just making sure that we can quickly put something together and have a real, strengthening some of our production systems.
Great, thank you. I'm monitoring some of the questions that are coming in, and these are great questions. We do have set sections kind of dedicated to answering some of these. So if you haven't heard your question be answered, don't worry, we're going to get to it. My next question, and Brad, you've mentioned this, the term POV has been come up a lot around this, and POV stands for point of view, for those of you who aren't familiar with design thinking. And so just very quickly, a point of view is a foundation to a human-centered audience-first strategy. And we believe that in an on-demand niche world that's not turning on the radio in your car, a POV or a target listener is crucial because a podcast can't be all things to all people, essentially. And we say this all the time, that a podcast designed for everybody is ultimately a podcast designed for nobody. And so when stations come to Project Catapult and PRX, the first thing we have them do is figure out who their target listener is, their point of view. This person is able to pose specific problems for a show to solve. They are a tool for intentional decision-making. They are an avenue for focused feedback, and they help define a tone and sonic identity that resonates with an actual person, and not just a vague idea of a person or a composite of hundreds of people. We believe, again, that like in an on-demand world where someone has to choose you, you have to appeal to that person. So we always say have a POV in mind. That person can actually inform a lot of greater decisions around advertising and marketing and other audience research. So I'm going to ask each of you, if you are able to, if you have an actual POV that you've actually went out into the world and found and interviewed, or if there was somebody that you had in mind, like a very specific figure or person that you were saying, this podcast is going to make this person happy, please tell me who they are and how you found them and why that person is important to your show. Brad, I think you're maybe itching to tell a story.
Sure. We did a little survey of listeners. We just picked up people through Twitter and I think Instagram who had been listening to our overall coronavirus coverage at Colorado Public Radio. Got about 30 or 40 responses and found some people who, based on their other podcast listening, we thought might be ideal for our show at a distance. And so after doing a few, maybe a half dozen interviews, maybe, I don't know if we did all of them that in depth, but we found one POV. Her name is Amethyst. She is currently furloughed. She works for the Parks and Rec department here in Denver and teaches preschool crafts and urban homesteading. And she likes to read fantasy novels in kind of an escapist way. She doesn't watch a lot of TV. Her favorite podcast is Kind World. And she specifically wished that the news media she followed would offer coverage that felt supportive or practical. And I think maybe comforting was in there as well. And those sort of all fit her needs as she's spending more time at home and wondering how to just kind of live a decent life and be a good citizen at this moment, for lack of a better term. And meeting her helped us think that, we had been putting in little sort of tips and advice bits since the first episode, but it reassured us that there is someone out there for whom this resonates. And it also highlighted for me that it is not this kind of plays off of what Stephanie says, it is not the typical CPR news listener. It is not the average news listener. This is someone who has somewhat gentler sensibilities, who is looking for something different emotionally out of this show. And we have to try to reach them in a different way or market it in a different way. So for all kinds of reasons, from having an actual photograph of this person, actual face to put with the audience we're making this for, all the way to how we think about reaching this audience, that was really helpful getting to know Amethyst. And those are all kind of like core Project Catapult advice and tips. Anyway.
Anyone else want to share who their POVs are, or important insights that you may have done into audience that have really helped shape your show in a way that you might not have if you hadn't done that?
I feel like at KPBS we're, not, because we just did things so fast, we're still identifying POVs or a POV. And the thing that I've been doing is we have a Facebook group for our members. And so I've been going directly to to them and engaging with them there. And one thing that was really helpful was, so the social distancing protests that have been happening across the country, you know, there's a lot of backlash from people about how the media is covering those protests. And, you know, if like me, you're pulling news that was produced by your fast moving news reporters who did, you know, day of this happened type reporting, even if you're taking that story from that, you know, produced for that morning, and you've had time to read articles about it and digest that information, they gave us feedback like, no, we wanted more context. Like, you can't, even if it's a daily podcast, there's something about the podcast they just expect, you know, more than this happened. They really want that context. So I got in a little bit of trouble for starting a fiery debate on that Facebook group. But the feedback I got was extremely valuable. And, you know, I'll always be thinking about those people when doing stories in the future and thinking, okay, what further context can I provide?
Our target listener is, we sort of went the route that Kinsey decided not to go. And we imagined our target listener to be, you know, someone who is, you know, sort of your average informed NPR listener who at this point is just burnt out, is on news overload, their schedule's out of whack, their nerves are frayed, and they're maybe just tired of listening to this constant fire hose of information and want to have a reliable, concise daily dose of particularly local news that they can sort of listen to when they're ready to listen to it at their convenience. They don't have to subject everybody else to it by having the radio on all day. They feel like they get what they need to know for the day. Then they have the option to take a break from the coverage for a little while. And like you heard Kinsey say, in our determinations of our ideal listener, you know, we came to the realization that NPR's national news, it tells the national story better than we're equipped to do. So we really, our strength is in keeping it very local, very Maryland based. Our podcast also has kind of a shift near the end, and it becomes almost like a locals bulletin board where we play listener voicemails, and we hope that gives our specific target listener, I think, a very immediate, tangible sense of their immediate community.
I'm going to jump in really quick because, Aaron, you brought up a really good point. Somebody has asked, and I'm sure we're all thinking as producers, whether you have a sense that your listeners are starting to get COVID fatigue. And if so, how are you keeping your podcasts fresh? And I know localization is one of them, but how are you keeping it fresh and infusing it with new ideas so that people will continue coming back to coverage that they may feel overwhelmed or tired of listening to, perhaps?
Well, I think actively encouraging the listeners to call in and provide essentially content for the tail end of the podcast every day gives them a sense of ownership. It keeps them plugged in and empowered. They feel like this is not just they're not just receiving this information of the day. They're hoping to create the content that we're putting on each day. And we'll take particularly compelling voicemails and then find other conversations to sort of follow up and give more context to what those callers are calling in. So it's like a live action feedback loop from episode to episode in terms of the listeners that we're hearing from and what they're telling us.
So I have to believe that there is an expiration date on these podcasts, which is why we launched ours as a pop-up series. Maybe it'll last a lot longer than I originally predicted. I toggle back and forth when I'm laying awake at night worrying about the black box of the future that lies ahead of us. I wonder when that is, but definitely I think watching your download numbers will be one easy way to see like, okay, well, no one wants us anymore. But I think more than anything, checking in with your POV and checking in with yourself, like, do we need to keep telling these stories? But that said, the way we try to keep it fresh, other than being local, is going back to our Catapult training of finding the narratives and finding good characters. So interesting people with interesting stories. Yes, they have a story directly related to COVID, but they also have backstories. And so, you know, maybe starting at the center of the E, but remembering to go back and be like, wait, who is this person? Why should I give a shit about him or her? And let me find out, like throwing in, you know, some narrative, I think can help.
I would say one thing that, and this is just a production thing, that we're really trying to do to make sure that we stay fresh and relevant and most importantly authentic with our audience is just to, you know, in the past we would do, I think, a lot more sort of traditional copy, then cut, then copy, then cut. We've been doing a lot of really long cuts and making, you know, doing trying to do the best we can with some sound design to really let people, you know, really let people fully experience a conversation in a way that doesn't feel so much like the news, but yet touches the topics. And I feel like it's a subtle way to make people feel like they're really having a much more of a real conversation, which plays to the strength of this particular medium. And that's just a small thing that we've done and tried to really keep in mind.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, I mean, the conversations that we've had about, you know, are people going to get tired of this? It's like there's a frenzy to this news. Things have changed so quickly that what we've really tried to do is each day just take one thing. And I'm sorry, someone is like hanging a picture next door. So if you hear drilling, that's what that is. We're trying to take like one topic, one person, and just kind of focus in for a period of 10 to 15 minutes. So it's kind of stepping out of that, you know, fire hose of news and hopefully turning that into a very small manageable stream of this big story that like no one can cover in its totality. And our hope is that maybe over the course of this project, you know, we will have looked back and said, okay, we went deep on this, we went deep on this, we went deep on this, and that the kind of the totality of the project did somehow cover a lot more real estate, but in a way that's not so overwhelming to listeners.
If I can jump in too, and I think something that really sets apart our training is that we ask a lot of our producers when they're putting together episodes or the arc of their shows is we want them to ask, you know, how do you want your listeners to think, feel, and what do you want them to do after they listen to any single episode? And I think a lot of what happens in news is that as newsmakers, we're saying, well, we know what our listeners need to know. But everyone kind of has access to all this information. So I think a great question to ask, and I think Kinsey or somebody asked that, someone said this, like we said, what do we want our listeners to feel at the end of this? And that could be actually what sets you apart from a lot of podcasts that are really good at conveying the same information, but you're doing it in a way that really takes emotional needs, perhaps cultural needs, societal needs that maybe a conventional news organization isn't. So one of my favorite questions, and it's something that Carrie Donahue taught me, was like, what do you want people to feel when this is over? And it's like, wow, I don't ever ask myself that enough. So if if that's some information that could help you, that's a good question to ask yourself, a good gut check every once in a while.
And Stephanie, that's a great point. And there was a question in the queue that made me think about that because someone asked, what are the key components of a prototype that are critical and cannot be overlooked? And I think that a prototype can be really rough and short and shabby, and you can still see if your POV or whoever you're getting feedback from, if what you're making is resonating with them. You could play your POV 2 minutes of the thing you're thinking about launching, and even if it doesn't have the right music and the editing's a little sloppy, you could get a sense of whether it's
Sorry, I think Brad, you might have cut out for me, so I don't know if you may have cut out for anyone else. So if you can repeat that last sentence.
Sorry about that. With a very short clip, if that's all you have, you can get a sense from your POV or whoever you want feedback from on whether you might be hitting their emotional needs or not, whether you are giving them the right impression or leaving them with the correct feeling that you're after when you play that for them. It doesn't take a full episode if you're still just thinking about launching a podcast.
Yeah, I think whenever we have our producers go through prototyping, we have them put out a couple of questions that they have to have answered. So if you know your show, if you know what you want, like what your show needs to accomplish, those would be kind of what you put forward and deciding if your prototype hits all those marks. So for you, it might be like, am I striking the right emotional tone? Or does this make sense? Like those are all questions you have to ask to have to go into your prototype. Awesome. I'm gonna jump ahead because I think this is a question. I think we can kind of lump marketing and advertising together. I know a question in the queue is, given the state of advertising now and how that's so core to the financial success of some podcasts, what's happening? What are you doing and what are you seeing? I think marketing and advertising kind of go hand in hand in this way. So if anyone has any advice or learnings about how they specifically got their show out and might potentially be sustaining it, please jump on in.
So I don't remember which other producer mentioned this, but we take our 20-minute pop-up episodes and produce a 8 to 10-minute segment for our daily show or our midday radio show. So that is helpful. But another weird thing that is happening is, obviously more people are consuming online news. So our website numbers are through the roof. And I just embed our podcast episode in related stories and make sure that there's a few different ways to access the podcast on our website. And if a story page, for instance, just performs well and gets indexed by Google or by Apple News or by Newsbreak or Smart News or one of those news aggregator apps, we'll get 20,000 visitors to that one page. And I would say about 10% of people do actually hit play and listen to podcasts on a website, which is so weird. But this is I think this is COVID-19 behavior. We're all on our computers working from home. We don't have coworkers around us, so we can just hit play. And instead of reading something, just listen to it if we're that type of people. Again, I'd say that's 10% or less percent of people who do this behavior, but it's been a significant source of traffic for us.
One thing that we've done for a number of years is really try and make good use of the broadcast side as well, because we have such a locally focused show that we always run 30-second promos with every new episode, and we've been really religious about making sure those are up to date every time we release a new episode and making sure that those sound as urgent but also as human as possible. And just to, again, just remind our local audience that the show exists. This is what we're talking about. But we're talking about it in a way that is a little different than the rest of the news is talking about it.
For us, in terms of getting the ball rolling with the audience discovery, we did a campaign of on-air and promotional spots for the podcast, some generic ones about, hey, what's this podcast about? Check it out. And then some specifically inviting listeners to call in and be part of the podcast, which I think got some good buzz about it. We've also set up pre-roll spots for this podcast to run at the beginning of all of our other podcasts at the station. Because I think, one of the things we learned is that people who listen to the radio may not be so inclined to listen to podcasts, but if they're listening to another podcast and they hear, a spot for a podcast, that transfers much better. So we're trying to get pre-rolls on all of our other podcasts. We've got the standard social media channels. We've had some nice press about the project in local print and web publications. And for us, that's about it in terms of marketing so far.
I should point out too, and we do have some attendees in this webinar who aren't affiliated with public radio stations or public media stations. They are independent producers. And so a lot of this advice doesn't apply to you because you may not have your own public radio station where you can run on your promos. And so I think advertising is obviously top of mind for independent producers. And I think this is true advice for if you work for an organization that financial success isn't guaranteed in podcasting. That's it's a real bummer, but it's not guaranteed. And so something that we tend to teach, or that we do teach and that we always bring up as our producers, is that you need to decide what success looks like for you. And for a lot of people that will be, you know, sustaining advertisements and sponsorships. It could be a number of downloads. It could be have like a certain number of downloads that you have to hit a month. But I think that podcasting is also an opportunity for you to think even bigger about what success might look to you, to your organization. And of course, money and sustainability are in there, but you can perhaps sell the sustainability of your show because you're hitting other important key metrics too, which may not be totally empirical, like download numbers or amount of money that you're making. So our next question will dig deeper into what success looks like for these shows, but I just want to make sure, does anyone else want to contribute anything else to how maybe you're promoting the show differently or in an exciting way? Maybe exciting is not the right word, but you know, effective way.
I think pitching it to, someone mentioned partnering. I think pitching it to, you know, if you're a public media station, pitching it to NPR. If you're an indie producer, pitching it to your daily newspaper. I mean, trying to, you know, get press for yourself. Pitching it to Apple, which who knows, they did a roundup of COVID podcasts featured on their site.
And if you're an indie producer pitching to a news outlet, being able to identify like not only that you have a target listener that you're hoping to reach with this, but like being prepared and having all those key elements, like this is the work we've done to make this possible. Here's exactly the story we want to tell. And these are the people who we know this will really resonate with. Those are all really effective tools when you're pitching. Any other advice or learnings?
I mean, this maybe gets into what success looks like for us too. And I know this is not open to independent producers, which I feel for y'all, I was that person at one point in my life. But we do a shortened version of the show every day in All Things Considered in Morning Edition. And that is a lot of work, I will admit. And it's not maybe marketing in the traditional sense, like we are running promos and doing things like that. We have gotten a little bit of press. But that for us is, you know, we have a very dedicated body of listeners that we're really trying to tap into, especially people who at this point are still hungry for this kind of content. And that kind of feeds into what success looks like for us. I mean, for my editors, you know, they know that they have from me a daily, essentially, segment that they can lean on, a longer conversation about what's happening with this pandemic. So it kind of feeds both the marketing beast, and with regards to success, my editors certainly have expressed that they like having that content to really rely on.
Great, so that leads into actually one of my favorite questions, and one of the things I love working through with all of our producers in our stations is defining success, because if we were all reaching to be This American Life or CNN, it just isn't feasible from a resource standpoint. But also, like, if we were reaching for This American Life and CNN, all of our podcasts would start sounding like This American Life and what comes out of CNN. And then the market would be so overwhelming that there really wouldn't be opportunities for innovative content. And so we ask each of our producers to really think about how success differs for each of them, because for public radio stations, you're all serving different audiences in different parts of the world and different parts of the country. And for independent producers, that's even more so. You might have an even more niche community that you're trying to reach. You have different resource capabilities, you have different visions. And so your success should also reflect how unique each of you are. And so I don't know if y'all have had a chance to get to this point at your stations, but to combine this question with another question that we got, like what is the point that you have to hit for you to be able to sustain the show? Like, what does success look like for you? Is there anything that you have to be able to bring back to your leadership to say that this is worthwhile?
I can try and tackle parts of that question. For We Live Here specifically, we've always sort of taken, and it's gone through hosting changes, it's gone through staffing changes. We've always kind of looked at it as almost building like a new kind of institution within the station that will really put a consistent lens of racial and economic equity on our region. So for me, when I think about what success looks like in this moment, our download numbers look better because we're releasing more content, you know, and it's a huge issue that everyone's following. So That's really not, I mean, that's wonderful to see, but the thing that I come back to, and I think is the most meaningful for our producers and our senior leadership at the station, is to see the anecdotal comments about, and the ones that stick the most are when people say they don't feel so alone in the way when they listen to something and when they hear an extended conversation about the issues that we get into, when they say, I don't feel so alone. Those are the ones that I feel like overall, in terms of the long-term health of this particular show, are the ones that really indicate success for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in public media's DNA to be very numbers driven. So I think I don't know, maybe I'm alone on this, but every management team is going to be looking at analytics and numbers and straight up download numbers and maybe set a benchmark for you. We don't have that benchmark yet, but I'm sure at some point I'll be asked. Right now, I've just been doing percentage of growth over total downloads because that's a better number for us right now. And then like other producers have said, it's taking the qualitative feedback that you get. So every time I get a text or a comment on social media that's positive about the podcast, I screen capture it and send it to station management. Because if you think about it, 1% of people donate. And so if you just have a small audience, but they love you, then that's great.
Yeah, Kinsey raises a really good point. I think you have to look at whether there's a core audience that you're reaching right now, whether your work is kind of satisfying to them. Raw numbers are a really tough metric right now. And in a world where there are truly 1,000 other coronavirus podcasts, I looked at the numbers, I don't believe that's an exaggeration. Trying to make a big racket in that landscape is very hard. And so you have to look at other metrics. Are you super serving the people you want to super serve? Did it reach new people who aren't listening to your broadcasts, and can you measure that? I think you have to look at other soft skills or other soft accomplishments, like for instance, on At a Distance, I have 2 co-hosts who are working on it, and one of them is a seasoned podcast reporter and producer, and the other has never worked on a podcast in their life. And so we get to use the skills of the veteran producer alongside the newbie, and she gets new experience. And those are great things for the future of our podcast work at Colorado Public Radio. Like I said, we take the podcast and repurpose it for one of our daily talk show, and we adapt it for that about once a week. And if our material is hitting our on-air listeners that way and reaching more ears that way, then that's a pretty good thing too, and something to remember. And we can all feel like we pitched into this massive reporting effort as coronavirus hit Colorado or whatever newsroom you're working with now. But it is a tough time going into such a crowded landscape of coronavirus podcasts. Is it's a tough move.
I'll speak for myself, and I'll tell you that success for me is when I can stop doing this thing. This is not, this is what we're creating as a tool right now for people, and success for me will be when we can put that tool away and say it did the job that it was supposed to do. It gave people one more option in their media diet. I mean, everybody's at home. You got your snack cupboard right there. You can snack all day. Same thing with the media. Same thing with your news. And this is the point of this project, as we envision it, is this is a way to, put yourself on a ration and, get what you need on a daily basis if the alternative, which is just constantly inundating yourself, is not doing you any good. And, when the time comes when you can put that tool away and it'll collect dust, I'll be happy.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to open it up for questions. There are some that we've kind of been answering over time. but I can make this kind of a lightning round. But did you all see any questions that you wanted to answer, that you all wanted to hit before I started reading some off?
I mean, I was maybe gonna pop on what I think that was Aaron said about ending this thing. That is a conversation that is still ongoing for our project, and I think especially because health reporting is my daily job. I have a really hard time seeing this not be everything that I cover for the next very long period of time. And so we are still, the conversations that we're having about when we stop doing this are very, very open-ended at this point. No one really knows what the future holds. I think for us, what I hope we can do in the future is get to a point where, once we're through the real, fire hose section of this, we can start to take a step back and make our shows maybe more of a respite for people who still want to stay informed on what's going on, but maybe, the everyday news is lost, has stopped paying as much attention to it as they once were. So that's how we're thinking about the future.
Someone asked about, curious if anyone, again, about maybe partnering with other local nonprofit newsrooms. We do. We partner with an online nonprofit news outlet for both radio and podcast. And I even think we have actually another online local nonprofit newsroom that produces their own podcast. And so there's definitely, I've had thoughts about, in pre-COVID, I don't think I don't think there would be a conversation to be had there, but maybe now there would be. So I think that's smart thinking.
One question I think some people, especially radio stations, are how much staff time are you all allocating to this? For some of you, this is your whole job now, but maybe for those of you who had to redistribute teams and figure it out, can you give some advice?
I've got 2 full-time producers on We Live Here, so that is their full-time job, is to make that show. And then it takes, because the production has stepped up, it probably takes 50% of my time right now.
This is for me, this is now my full-time job. I had to, I had another podcast that's just on the back burner indefinitely until I have time to return to it. So, we're like most news organizations, I'm sure your production staff is probably doing everything it can be and should be doing already. And so when there's a new project that comes up, something's got to be sacrificed. So this is 5 days a week for me. And I work with our news editor who puts in a fair bit of time on this as well. And then of course, all the news department content is coming our way. So we're making the most of the resources, the material that's already being researched and reported on the air, but to make the daily podcast, it's full time for me for the foreseeable future, and then a good couple hours a day for our editor as well.
So for us, in order to make the daily news podcast sustainable, we were tasked with getting it to within 2 hours of work a day, which I have not hit that yet. And right now we're at about 3 hours of my time every night, 2 hours of a sound designer, and 1 hour of a news editor. So will we ever get that process down to 2 hours total? Probably not. But going back to the success metric, I think what we're doing is showing process and paving out a way and showing what a public media news team really needs to invest if they really want a real daily news podcast. And the bare minimum, right? Because these other big daily podcasts, they have 16 producers. Up First has, 7 producers, 6 producers. But, it can be done maybe in 2 hours if you're going with, what's that term, Stephanie? Lowest
minimum desirable product, MDP. Yeah.
If you're going for the minimum desirable product, you could do it in 2 hours a day for the daily news COVID podcast. But I wouldn't recommend it. None of us, especially my sound designer, who is just a complete audiophile snob, just wouldn't want to work on a product like that. So, and then I do work full time on our weekly longer form narrative podcast with the idea that once life gets back to normal, which I'm like having serious doubts that it ever will. I'm really just in a depressive state. Sorry to be such a downer, but if it does happen, then I'll go back to the Border podcast full time.
I mean, I would say that this has certainly become a full-time job for me. I was already doing this. I think the question about time is also a question about, I know our newsroom has just, everyone's beat has kind of been blown up and everyone is now a coronavirus reporter. And so while I am now working on this project, it's also allowed me, because I have some knowledge as the health reporter in our newsroom, the space to not only do this project, but instead of reporting stories, help my colleagues as they report theirs, by providing them resources, by helping them think about how to report a health story. I think when I first got started with this, I was really concerned, well, I'm not going to be able to report in the same way, but really I still feel like I'm starting to find ways to kind of share that knowledge with our whole new staff of very newly launched health reporters.
Our staffing is a little different. By design, it's kind of a side project for the two reporters who co-host the project. And so depending on whether they're taking the lead on the story or acting in a more supportive role, they're probably spending, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 12 hours a week on it, while also doing things like hosting newscasts and reporting daily features for the radio. And then we have a producer who's more in the 25 to 30 hour week range, who's sort of shepherding the material along. And again, this is a weekly show, so it's a different schedule than some of the others that people have discussed. And then I'm sort of dropping in kind of an editor capacity. That's what our staffing looks like. It's tough to make it work. Every podcast needs to be its own distinct assembly line, and this is kind of where we've landed on this one.
I like Ann Lopez's question about recrafting the COVID-19 podcast to focus on the aftermath and recovery of the pandemic, or if we have an end date. For me, like I've already said, I'm really hoping for an end date. And I think what all the newsrooms are doing is showing like, hey, if there's a big story in our community, we should pivot and we should do a long form, 6-part, 7-part, 10-part, whatever it takes. We should pull reporters over here, do this. We know we can do it. We proved that we could do it through our COVID-19 podcasts. So let's do it with, the story about how our local school district is failing to educate kids with special needs, right? That I think that will be the most positive thing that comes out of all of this. Just getting back to the broad question of should I do this or not, like, people have brought up Kind World, and we actually are doing we partner with them for just promo trades, and they are doing really well right now. So I do know that there is negative story fatigue and COVID-19 podcast fatigue. So it is, maybe if you decide not to do a COVID podcast, maybe you think about what is making Kind World so successful right now, or Modern Love, like stories about love and hope and kindness. Like, I think people are actively searching that out right now.
One thing I want to add too, and I should have said in the very beginning when asking if you should start a coronavirus podcast, it's, I think, an important question to ask yourself and your station is, what do you want to get out of it? And I think perhaps we want to stay on top of things may not always be the best answer, or that everyone else is doing it might not always be the best answer, but it's okay if it is. But I think something that we really value as part of PRX and our Project Catapult is intentionality and intention in the decisions that you make. And so if you can answer very succinctly, like, we need to start a podcast for XYZ reasons for these people, I think then that's a great start. And we always believe that we're walking into a project with that kind of intention, trying to make something meaningful is always the baseline you should start with. So that's all the questions that we've gotten. And I know, Terry, you have an announcement for another webinar right after this, because what's a better way to spend a Tuesday than in back-to-back webinars? But Terry, I'm really excited about your webinar. So if you want to take some time to, I guess, introduce people to it and bring them over.
Yes, thanks, Stephanie. And hats off to everybody on the podcast or on the webinar today about podcasts. Kinsey, Aaron, Sam, Brad, and Tim, you guys are fantastic. Looking forward to listening into your podcasts from afar. I want to just take a very brief moment and let everyone know about a fantastic project that PMJA is launching today. Thanks in part to a large bit of support from PRX. This is the PMJA Editor Corps. We had to cancel our conference in June for obvious reasons. We're looking for something we can do to help bring some relief to the system, to help out in some way, shape, or form. So we are launching today an editor corps. We've got about 14 editors on the bench. We're expecting this group of editors to grow. They're freelance editors who will be able to drop into stations on a daily basis and help stabilize workflow, work with reporters, to help get spots out, to help with editing parts of a daily podcast if need be, to help with news features. This is a service that for the time being will be offered free of charge to stations. And so we are putting on a PMJA Editor Corps informational webinar at 3 o'clock today. I'll put the registration link real quickly into the chat box here. But I want to thank everybody for taking the time to check that out today. If you don't have time, which you've got to get back to podcast production, but I bet there's someone in your newsroom, an editor or news director, who might have a chance to be a part of that. So it'll also be recorded and archived, so you can take a look at it later on. But we are launching this project to help bring some relief to a bunch of people at stations who are overworked and overtaxed and overstressed. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Terry. So this is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Kinsey, Aaron, Sam, Brad, Tim, for taking the time to share what you've learned. Thank you, Carrie, for manning the question booth. And thank you, Terry, for just being here and co-hosting this with us. This webinar was recorded, and we plan on sending it out through the registration link that you all signed up for through this. So if you had to duck out, or if there are other people at your station that wanted to watch this but couldn't register on time, that's fine. You'll get a link to the recording tomorrow. So thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon, and good luck with all of your podcasting. Thanks so much.
Bye.